There are a lot of settings to play with in Resident Evil Village on PC, and today I'd like to take you through a few of them, tell you a bit about what they do, and how each one might affect the visual quality of your game. I'm Ron Burke, Editor-in-Chief for GamingTrend.com, and this is our brief look at the PC version of Capcom's Resident Evil Village. Let's get started. Opening up the PC version of the game and heading into the settings, I want to start off where I started, with the settings grayed out. I have an RTX 3080, so why in the world is ray tracing disabled here? After some exhaustive research, it turns out that Resident Evil Village utilizes the October 2020 Windows 10 patch, specifically the Windows 10 version 20H2 update. 20H2 brings with it DirectX 12 Ultimate. This update brings things like variable rate shading, performance updates, DirectX inline ray tracing, sampler feedback and texture space shading, better streaming engine support, mesh shaders, and a whole hell of a lot more. For whatever reason, my machine decided that it did not want Edge installed, so it rejected this update, requiring a full reinstallation of Windows to get back in business. With everything reinstalled and patched, it's time to get rolling. There are a number of presets, specifically Prioritize Graphics, Prioritize Performance, Balanced, Ray Tracing, and Max. We don't use presets around here, but generally speaking, Prioritize Graphics will give you the best overall look. Performance is used when your GPU has less than 4 gigs of RAM, or if you just want to push the frame rate. Balance does what the name suggests, giving you a clean balance between graphics and performance. Max is Max. I'm not sure what you expected. Something to note is that these memory utilization numbers are just estimates provided by the game and are merely reservations, not utilization. Here we see Prioritized Performance coming in at just under 4 gigs of reservation. Recommended comes in at 5.7 gigs of VRAM and Balanced is 4.82 gigs reserved. Ray Tracing will reserve 5.71 gigs of VRAM and will probably have the largest impact on frame rate, but damn does it look good. Max, as you might suspect, is going to pull all the sliders to the right. During testing, we saw reservations hit just over 12 gigs at that setting. Again, that's not utilization, but what the game suggests all of the selected features could potentially use. It does go to show that these in-game estimates are not often directly tied to the reality of the performance you'll receive. Throwing all those presets out the window, let's look at the individual settings and what they do. Strap in because there's a lot. Screen resolution is pretty self-explanatory. It's the resolution you selected, represented by the number of pixels from left to right and the number of pixels up and down. Vertical synchronization, or V-Sync, is meant to synchronize the monitor and the graphics card, ensuring that they stay in lockstep. As your GPU is very likely able to provide frames faster than the refresh rate of your monitor, V-Sync will lock the GPU's frame rate to the maximum frame rate of the monitor to prevent screen tearing. Rendering mode. I'm surprised to see this setting here, as it's somewhat anachronistic of a time I thought we moved past by this point. Normal renders every pixel on every line for every frame, fairly standard in today's gaming world. Interlace instead renders half the frames on the first pass and the other half on the second, so imagine lines 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and so forth on the first frame, and then 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on for the second frame. Switching to interlace has a huge impact to image quality, especially lighting and shadows. Yes, you'll see a solid improvement to frame rate, but unless you're running the game on a potato, you'd be better off to play with other settings first. Image quality is next on the list. This setting ranges from 0.5 to 2.0, revealing that a more accurate name for this would be upscaling or supersampling. You can set the game to render what's on screen at full resolution, 100%, or 1.0 in this case, or you can tweak it up and down. 0.5 would be half your selected resolution, 720p if you were running 1080p resolution for example, or 200%, which of course would double it. Fidelity FX CAS is a piece of AMD tech, though it'll run just fine on any NVIDIA card, that's meant to do something similar to what DLSS offers. Fidelity FX CAS aims to dynamically adjust the game's resolution when the frame rate dips. This post-processing effect works relatively well, though it doesn't deliver as many frames as you might hope. Anti-aliasing is always a smorgasbord of options, and all with wildly different results. Aliasing is the small jagged edges of a surface, most often visible when there's a large contrast between two semi-stationary objects. This tech looks to smooth those out using various techniques. I could do a whole video series on just these, but Capcom's removed a lot of the choice, giving you just two options: FXAA plus TAA and TAA. There isn't even a toggle to turn it off. You can see the visual quality difference in the thumbnail. The frame rate difference between them, though, is negligible, with TAA giving you better image quality and FXAA giving you better performance. I would recommend TAA. Variable rate shading, or VRS, is a relatively new bit of tech from NVIDIA that allows developers to affect pixel shaders as a group or in a specific area instead of just one at a time. It also means that developers can focus the large amount of shading where the user is looking, with a lower shading rate at the edges. There's a whole algorithm that drives this, but suffice it to say that it's a way of improving frame rate at a slight hit to the per pixel shading of some objects. In motion, it's hard to detect, which is the whole point. Texture quality is another self-explanatory one. Texture quality is the graphic fidelity and complexity of the textures that are displayed on people, creatures, and objects in the environment. Texture filter quality is another tool in the box to help with the complexity of textures being displayed. It looks at the adjacent textures in the distance and essentially inherits the color and clarity properties of its neighbors. In practice, this means you can look into the distance and see clearly defined objects rather than the bokeh blurriness for things that are on the horizon. The 2x, 4x, 8x, and 16x refers to the steepness of the angle that this filtering will occur, but the hit to frame rate is so slight that you might as well crank this one all the way to the top. Mesh quality. Everything in the game is built from polygons, and those polygons are linked together to create a face, gun, tall vampire lady to step on you, or whatever. The higher the mesh quality, the more polygons will be in that mesh. This will take the rougher edges off of objects, making them look more smooth and thus more realistic. This can be pretty hard on frame rate, but if image quality is your goal, you should leave this one on high. And now we come to ray tracing. Ray tracing is the real-time technique of tracing light realistically through a scene to have it react to objects in that scene. It allows light to bend and warp around an object, providing the most lifelike representation of light and shadow, albeit at the cost of a lot of horsepower. That said, there's no denying that it looks absolutely gorgeous. So if you've got the hardware, this one needs to be set to on and on high whenever possible. GI and reflection. First off, GI stands for global illumination. Global illumination is the diffused lighting in games that provides more of a soft glow than a harsh pin light source. This indirect lighting is also handled by RTX, meaning developers can place light sources and then let the Turing cores on your GPU decide how that light permeates the scene. Reflection is then paired with this, and that light will likely reflect off of objects like a shiny wooden banister or a marble floor. Ambient occlusion is a technique to make shadows look more realistic by softening the results. Rather than simply drawing a jagged cutout of a character or object behind them, a light source can hit a subject and cast a soft shadow realistically based on their relationship to the light source. Screen space reflections is one of those easily overlooked features that really makes a scene come to life. Yes, it's very expensive on the GPU, but what it does is it takes the rendered scene and duplicates it as a reflection. We see this used frequently in distorted puddles that reflect the sky above, or a shiny marble floor that shows a decorative ceiling. Volumetric lighting quality is another somewhat expensive lighting technique that combines the attributes of global illumination with indirect lighting. It creates the quote-unquote God rays that we see when light streams through a window. One of my favorite technologies that's so tiny but makes such a huge difference is subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering is a lighting technique that lets light pass through semi-transparent objects. We mostly see this in skin. In a day and age where you can see the pores on the skin of our favorite heroes and villains, this gives developers new ways to bring those characters to life. Light casting through hair, paper that's semi-transparent, and candles are all brought to life through subsurface scattering. Shadow quality is, well, it's the quality of the shadows cast by objects. I'm not sure if you were expecting more, but that's the long and short of it. Higher quality shadows means more accurately reflecting the object casting said shadow, reflecting their movements or any objects they might be holding. Here, you've got the nebulous low, medium, and high, but it's readily apparent in the thumbnail what it's showing. Contact shadows, as the name suggests, is about the quality of shadows as they impact objects. This allows the shadow to lengthen, deform, bend, and otherwise traverse the screen as a light ray naturally impacts an object. When you see a shadow cascade from an overhead light source and then bend at a natural angle when it connects with an adjacent wall, you've got the idea. We are long past the days of shadows just casting a dark spot on things. Shadow cache is a toggle here, either being on or off. That's because you're either loading all the shadows into the VRAM cache, or you're loading them when they occur. There are a total of 22 options to play with before you even start the game, so what are the heavy hitters? Well, I've been benchmarking each and every one of them, and I have to say that this game is fairly well optimized, but some of these are a little heavier than others. Let's start with the non-ray tracing basics. Shadow cache is only going to save you about 1% by preloading shadows. Interlaced render mode will save you a shocking amount at roughly 34%, but wow does it make a visual difference. Truthfully, this would be my last resort. This will push the frames from around 110 frames to 140 frames per second, but at the cost of a lot of visual quality. TAA versus FXAA plus TAA shouldn't be a question at all. I saw a whopping 0 frame difference between the two. Enjoy the higher quality and select TAA. Surprisingly, texture detail had a minimal impact on frame rate as well, with only a 4 frame difference between the lowest and the highest values. It seems these are streamed very efficiently, so bump this to high and don't look back, as long as you've got an 8 gig card to fill up. If not, scale accordingly as you don't want to create a buffering situation. In point of fact, nearly every one of the 22 available options will add between 1 and 2% load to your card. Texture filter, mesh quality, and bloom push this up to 5%, and volumetric lighting adds 6%. It's shadow quality and ambient occlusion that weigh the most. Ambient occlusion costs a whopping 11%, and that's pretty significant. Tack on the 12% that shadow quality will cost you, and you can see where the heavy lifting is happening for your GPU. Now let's get to the big stuff: ray tracing. Variable rate shading will save you about 7% for you to use elsewhere, and depending on how powerful your card is, you're going to need it. Enabling ray tracing will take your frame rate on a 3080 from around 250 frames per second at 1080p down to 172 when combined with global illumination and ray trace light reflection. At 4K on a 3080, I'm seeing around 125 frames per second with a drop down to 119 frames per second. A true testament to the power of the 3080. Now that frame rate drop sounds like a lot, but honestly there's no way I would play this without ray tracing. The difference between low and high is around 2 frames per second, so you might as well crank it up all the way. Honestly, I'm not even sure why there's an option to bump these down. So after looking through a whopping 22 options, there's really only a few that make a difference. Skip out on the interlacing. It's better to run at a lower resolution than to cause that much visual damage. Ray tracing is expensive, but this game does run remarkably well, even on more modest hardware. I was able to run it cleanly at a whopping 118 frames per second at 1080p with ray tracing disabled on a 1080 Ti. With a 3060 at max settings and ray tracing set to maximum, I saw 90 frames per second at 1080p. If you have a reasonably powered PC of any caliber, you'll be in the clear on this one. If you enjoyed this analysis, hit the like button and consider subscribing. It helps us out, and you wouldn't want to let an algorithm tell you what to do anyway. Thanks for watching. Let us know in the comments how you've been enjoying Capcom's recent installment. Happy gaming, and we'll see you again very soon.